Good morning, church. Great to be here with you this morning. We this morning are talking about money because money is one of those things that tends to interrupt our lives all the time, oftentimes at the least opportune moments. Whether it's because money has come along in the form of worries about money, because we have an unexpected car repair, our basement is flooding, our family member who lives away from us gets sick, groceries get more expensive, the mortgage rates go up just before we renew. By the way, those are all personal examples. Or maybe it's opportunities. Maybe there's an opportunity to use someone else's money to get what you want sooner by getting easy credit for something. Or maybe there's the promise of the big win where it will change your life to the max. Or maybe it's constantly advertisers going after your dollars by telling you about the next greatest thing you need that will finally make you happy. Money is one of those things, or conversations about money, that comes at us all the time in our world, constantly interrupting life. And honestly, the messaging that we're getting about money, the story that we're being told about money, is one that has not proven to be good for human flourishing. Now, this idea, though, that money inserts itself into our life in just sort of an interrupting kind of way is not new. In fact, Jesus was once teaching a crowd of people, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, someone interrupted his sermon to ask Jesus to help with a family financial dispute. Here's what happened. Someone in the crowd said to him, Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Out of the blue, Jesus is dragged into a money dispute. He wasn't teaching on money, but this interruption comes out of the blue. But rather than just ignore this or say, "Hey, buddy, listen, money's not that big a deal. It doesn't matter," Jesus actually uses this as a teaching moment to prompt people to consider our attitude about money. Not just money, but also the possessions we get with our money, and teach us how to change our perspective to one that will be life-giving instead of enslaving to the very money that we want to use. Now, I recognize this is a hard conversation. I was not really looking forward to this morning, but I warned you. Okay? In fairness, I warned you. Before we hit June, I said we're going to have hard conversations in June, and so here we go. But here's what I hope. I hope that as we have this challenging conversation, that you will hear Jesus' heart for you today. That he doesn't actually want you to be enslaved to your money, or lack thereof, which might be the case for you, but rather to be able to flourish in life as you choose to step out and follow him. Because God doesn't actually care about your money, he cares about you. But a way to actually deal with the heart sometimes is also to deal with how we actually interact with our money. Now, when Jesus wanted to talk about hard things, oftentimes he would use a story to get into the heart of that difficult conversation. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 12 today, if you want to turn there in your Bible. We started in verse 13. We'll pick it up in verse 14 as we get to this story that Jesus is going to tell. Jesus replied to this guy who asked him the question, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." Well, let's take a few minutes and unpack this Jesus story, where we see the primary player in the story is a wealthy farmer. who has a great year. He's already wealthy, and he has a really good year with a bumper crop. Now, as a good businessman, he wants to maximize the revenue he gets from his harvest. So rather than put his abundant crop out into the marketplace, where probably there's already a decent amount out there, and the prices will be lower as a result, he withholds it. And he decides to put it in storage to be able to sell his grain when there's less available, and the price will, as a result, be higher, increasing his profit margin and also increasing his market share within the community. He's a good businessman. He's actually trying to do things that will serve his own interests very, very well. But there's two big problems with what he does, especially actually in his culture, which was not an individualist culture, but a collectivist culture. These are major problems, scandals, really. The first one was that he acted without regard for the community. His thinking was siloed. Thank you for that pity laugh. That was appreciated. He lived in a subsistence economy, right, where people were living literally paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, farm right to your table. This was how people lived. So withholding his abundant crop from the rest of the marketplace, from the rest of the community, could be harmful to others and to the local economy. And notice, too, the way he makes his decision. He only talks to himself as he makes the decision. He doesn't consider other voices from the community or what they might need as he's making his decision. He's actually a pretty good capitalist, isn't he? He's about private ownership, working the supply and demand thing to his benefit. He's motivated by profit, and he's driven by self-interest. He's an incredible capitalist. That is not a compliment in this story. So rather than acting for the community with the community in mind, he acts only with regard for himself. That's problem number one. Problem number two is he also acts with no regard for what God might want him to do with his abundant crop. He actually looks at what he has harvested and what he has as the source of his security. He considers the things he has made and the provisions that he has stored up for himself to be the source of his security or life. That is where he is putting his trust. Which really, if you think about putting our trust in something, putting our hope for our life in something, that is choosing to worship that thing. This is idolatry that this man is committing, looking to his money and possessions rather than to God to trust in for his life. Jesus in Matthew 6 gave a name to that idol. He called it mammon, the worship of the abundance of money. And because this man has chosen to serve money and his possessions rather than choosing to serve God, God calls him a fool, which doesn't just mean he's stupid, but it means that he has actually chosen to rebel against God, and his actions deny God. So Jesus uses the story of this foolish farmer to illustrate that the root problem of the guy who came to him with the initial question about dividing his inheritance with his brother, the root problem of all that is the self-serving greed. Now, it's not hard to see how this is still applicable for us today, is it? I really hope that's not a hard connection for you to make. Because we live in a world where we have basically baptized greed and said it's okay. We celebrate greed. We say it's amazing when people get so much stuff that they couldn't possibly need anything else and they still get more. And we look up to them and go, wow, they're amazing. How is it that we idolize people who have been served by this incredible sense of greed? We come to this conclusion that it is okay to continually accumulate for ourselves with no respect for God or others. I mean, in part, this is a problem of the system that we live in. This is the air we breathe in the world we live in. Because Western capitalist economies are driven by a need to constantly be in a state of growth. If we're not in a state of growth, we're in trouble, right? Which means that as individuals, we need to constantly consume more and more in order to prop up an economy that continues to need to grow. Which means we have moved way beyond needing to buy what we need. We're even past buying what we want. Now we're into the place of buying whatever the advertisers can convince us will make us happy or that we need. That's the level of stuff we're functioning at. Our system is built on this idea of growth without limit. In the natural world, there's really only one thing that's able to grow without limits, and that's cancer. It'll only grow until it kills its host. And honestly, this way of dealing with money and thinking about money within the system that we're living in is killing us. This is not a healthy way to continue to function. Now, the good news about what we're talking about today is that Jesus doesn't just hold up a mirror for us to see the problem in ourselves of going, crap, I'm a greedy person, this is terrible. Because that would be really depressing. He actually also offers us a solution to move into a more life-giving way of seeing the things we have so that truly our lives can flourish and not just be enslaved to the stuff we have. And we feel that slavery in lots of ways, don't we? The need to have better locks and more security cameras, make sure people don't steal stuff off our porch when we get a package delivered to us. Constantly, we have this increasing anxiety and worry about protecting the increased amount of stuff we have. But what we see in Jesus' teachings is that the antidote to greed and living with a heart attitude of greed is generosity. And really, the mutually reciprocating relationship between generosity and trust. Trust in God so that we actually will become generous. And as we're generous, we get to learn more trust in God. But how do we get there? How do we move from greed over to generosity? Well, I want to suggest there's two things we can do. I think these both come from the teachings of Jesus. First, we need to change our answer to the question, what makes you secure, or what gives you life? Greed says that security is in the abundance of our possessions or our savings. Our security is in making sure we have enough stored up so that we will be okay. But when our heart is trusting in the abundance of our stuff to make sure we're going to be okay one day, that again becomes idolatry. That stuff begins to become our God when our security and our hope for our future is placed in it. Generosity, on the other hand, understands that our security, first and foremost, is in God. And He is the one who is the provider of all that we have and all that we need. He is the one who provides us eternal security for our heavenly home. He is also the one that provides for our day-to-day needs. Nothing that we have is anything that we have not received. We've received everything that belongs to us from His hand. Which is why Jesus actually carries on in this text to say this. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Anyone able to do that? Just checking, okay? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will He clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things. And your Father knows that you need them. But seek His kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the poor, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Yeah. Shifting our thinking. greed to generosity. If God cares about ravens and wildflowers, how much more does he care about you? How much more does he love you and want what's best for you? Incidentally, little context thing for you. Context of Luke 12 is that it follows Luke 11. Yeah, very good. You guys are with me this morning. That's good. In Luke 11, Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. And one of the things, of course, in the Lord's Prayer is, Lord, give us today our daily bread. He's teaching them to actually trust with their needs to God so that he will be the one to provide for them. So the first piece Jesus offers us in order to move from greed to generosity is to find our security in God and in seeking his kingdom first, not in the abundance of our stuff. Now the second thing, though, and he encourages it in this text, as we just read, is to start training, to actually step out in faith and trust God with stuff. We are not going to shift our heart without challenging or changing our behavior with our stuff. Because as he said at the end there, where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. So what we choose to do in action with our treasure will help our heart get to the same place. So let's start training. So how does God train his people to be generous toward himself and toward others? Well, in the Old Testament, when God had his Old Testament people, Israel, he had a very specific way of training his people to live generously towards God and others. And that was through the system of the tithe. Now, maybe you've heard of the tithe. Tithe is a word that means 1/10 or 10%. And so oftentimes this is spoken of as a principle for giving, is that this is sort of a standard of, 10% of what we bring in, that's what we give to the Lord, because that's what they did in the Old Testament. So there's lots of discussion about this. There's lots of debates. Does the New Testament still require a tithe? Jesus didn't really talk about tithing, da-da-da-da-da. But what I want to do is just take a minute to talk about what this looked like as a training tool with God training his people to live generously towards God and towards one another. Because as you look at the Old Testament tithe, I don't know if you've ever done a little bit of a search into this, there was actually 3 tithes. It wasn't 10%. There was 3 different tithes that God put in place for his people. There was the Levitical tithe, which is the one we often talk about. That's the one that went to the support of the temple and all the work that went on there. There was the festival tithe, and then there was also the poor tithe. And I put a third there because it was 1/10 of all that you had that you gave once every 3 years. So really it's a 3 1/3% gift every year, right? So let's quickly talk about all 3 of these. So the Levitical tithe, like I said, was support for those whose job it was to serve God and God's people through what happened in the sacrificial system in Israel. So really, it was about the community's relationship with God and maintaining their worship and dedication to him. That was what the first tithe was about, making sure the people as a whole would maintain and grow in their relationship to God. The second tithe, which is an interesting one, was the festival tithe. That was 10% of your income that you set aside in order to actually go and worship during the festivals that God called his people to worship at. So it would give you means by which you could celebrate the Sabbath, by which you could celebrate Hanukkah eventually. You could go do the Passover, Feast of Tabernacles, all these different festivals you needed to participate in. You'd have money set aside for because you set aside a tithe so that you'd have animals to eat as you partied it up, celebrating the good things God had done. Isn't that cool? Like God actually told you to set aside money to have a party so you could enjoy the good things and celebrate him, which really prioritizes an individual's or family's relationship with God as you participate in all these festivals and reminders of God's goodness to you. The third tithe was one for the poor, which is all about just helping the vulnerable in the community, prioritizing equity and community flourishing for everyone so that nobody would have too little. So really, if you want to talk about tithing in the Old Testament, it's not 10%, it's 23 1/3%. That's actually what tithing meant in the Old Testament. Now on top of this, and this is even more than that, God encourages people to give free will offerings. If you had a particularly abundant year like that farmer did in the story, there's opportunity to give above and beyond what your tithe was because you just want to say, thank you, God, for your incredible abundance in my life. Not only that, but for the poor, there were laws in place in God's law where they actually were not allowed to cut to the edges of their field so that there would always be something on the margins for those who were vulnerable to come behind and glean and get what they needed for their daily food. God provided training in generosity that would be healthy not only for an individual, but for the whole community. Do you see that? Like, it's an incredible system God put in place through the tithes to help start to shape his people's hearts to actually trust in him and not in the abundance of their stuff. Now, as we turn the page to the New Testament, the language changes a bit. And oftentimes we see a lot more talking about generosity than we see talking about a tithe. But there are still similar categories of giving when we think about the generous giving that is encouraged by the New Testament writers to the early church. There's similar categories where they were called to support the whole work of the church through the ministry of those who were called to serve within a local church or to go beyond on mission for God to plant churches elsewhere. That's a similar thing to the Levitical tithe, right? We have an idea of investing in your own life with God, which is about our personal life with God and worship of him. And also we see very much a sense of also caring for the poor and taking care of those who are vulnerable in the community around us. These things all show up as well in the New Testament. Now, there may be a bit of a debate, though, over how much is generous. You know, in the Old Testament, God gave specific numbers. In the New Testament, he doesn't. So what does generosity actually mean? Is it more, less? What is it? Is it a tithe? Like, what is it supposed to be? Well, honestly, as I look at it, a lot of the talk about generosity comes from Paul. Paul, who had been a Pharisee, who was well-versed in the Old Testament law, who had been trained in the system of the tithes that God had given his people to observe. Personally, I think it's unimaginable that Paul could have had any sense that being generous toward God was less than what he grew up knowing through the tithe. You can make a case for whatever you're going to do. I mean, you're supposed to decide, it tells us in the New Testament, in our heart with the Lord, what is right for us to give. But I do find it hard to believe that anything less than that would be considered generous, at least in Paul's eyes. You know, it's interesting, as you hear stories about people who have started to grow in this expression and train themselves in generosity. You hear stories of actually, people, and they're well-off people, but they actually get to a place of doing a reverse tithe, where they choose to live on 10% and give 90% to the Lord. Because they've actually come to a place of learning and growing in this, testing God in this, seeing what he would do for provision, and ultimately giving more than a tithe. Like we talked about last week, everything we have is his anyways. So whether we're giving it specifically to the purposes of the kingdom through a church or through mission or those kinds of ways, or whether we're keeping it within our own home, everything we have is supposed to be for his kingdom purpose. Whether you're inviting a neighbor over for dinner or whether you're giving at the church, it's all for his kingdom. Now that all sounds really good. Maybe it actually sounds terrible. I don't know. Maybe it sounds terrible to you. But I do want to acknowledge the fact that there is a risk in this. It is a leap of faith to step off and begin to trust God in training in generosity, particularly for those who feel like we don't have much to begin with, and we're already stretched thin with the rising cost of housing, the rising cost of groceries, the rising cost of everything. But in my own story, in Tara and my story, we actually started to learn to tithe, at least the 10% part, to the church while we were at seminary. And it was the time in our life, I would say, when we probably had the least of any other time. We've had some times that have been lean, but that time was really lean. And it was hard. Frankly, it was really, really hard. It wasn't like our tithe was that big, right? Because we didn't have much. But it was really hard to part with that on a weekly or monthly basis. But I can tell you that as we have been able to have more now, as we have, grown in our earning and things like that, it has made it easier that we started with something small to now continue the practice when we have more than to start when you have more and you feel more protective of it. So whether you have lots or a little, training and tithing, is a good thing to step into. And incidentally, this is actually an incredible thing. I don't know if you know this. This is the one place in all of Scripture that God invites us to test him in something. Did you know that? Usually testing God's a really bad idea. You're not supposed to put God to the test. However, in Malachi 3:10, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty. He gives us permission. Test him in it. And see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. He invites us, as we grow in generosity by tithing, to actually test and see what he will do. And when we test him in this, when we sacrificially give to him, one of the great blessings that we get to experience is seeing how God provides in crazy ways that we would never expect. We heard it last week from Michael and Morgan, and I heard a story about it on Wednesday that I want Richard to come up and share with you this morning, if you would, because it's always great and fun to hear wild stories about the ways that God chooses to provide. If you guys don't know Richard, Richard's been part of our church since the fall, and heading up the Set Free Recovery House. So, Richard, why don't you tell us what happened over this last week?
We drive a really old '06 van. We're swapping over our winter tires to summer tires, and our summer tires were in really bad shape, and the van was really pulling to the right really bad. And we needed new tires, and so I called around, and I was getting quotes between, $1,200, stuff like that, and I was like, okay, well, we can't really afford this, and then so I called Fountain Tire, and I told him, we need new tires, how much for a wheel balancing, and he gave me a quote. I think it was 16 and change, so around $1,700 in taxes. And I was like, well, we can't afford that. And I said, well, we are a charity. We're not a charity, we're a nonprofit. We're working on our charity status. And he says, what do you do? And I said, well, we get men off the streets, and we're helping stop addiction. And he says, well, that's awesome. I'll give you 50% discount. I said, 50%? Really? He goes, yeah, half price. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. That's awesome. 50%? He goes, yeah, that'll be $700 and some odd dollars. I said, let's book it in. He goes, I got to order the tires in. They'll be here next week. And I said, okay, awesome. And then even $700, we're like, well, that's a big stretch. $700, we don't really have that money. But we'll trust, Lord, that you're going to make a way. So we take the van in, we get it all worked on. We head up, Jeremy and I head up to go pick up the van, and we pull in to pay for the van, and we're standing there, and she goes, yeah, it's all good, it's ready to go, yeah, just give me a second, I'll go grab the bill, here you go. And she slams the bill, and she goes, it's all good, it's all been paid for. So we ended up not paying anything to have our tires balance changed and put on, when we couldn't even afford in the beginning to pay for the tires to be put on, because we've been running on nothing.
Yeah.
My wife and I used our own personal finances to start Joshua House, to start Set Free Recovery here, and so we've been running on a shoestring budget. So God provides when you believe in him, and we call it water walking, getting out of the boat and trusting that the Lord's going to make a way where there seems to be no way. So there you go. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Isn't that awesome? We see God do crazy things when we step out in crazy ways. I want to share, just before we wrap this up, both a danger as well as a confession. So there's the thing. There is a danger in choosing to not live faithfully in this area of our finances. There's a danger in not choosing to follow Jesus in this area of our life. And there's a danger for us individually, because God, as we saw last week, and even as we see this week in his story, will demand an accounting from us for what we do with what we have been given. Last week we said, what we do with what we have says a lot about who we love and what we're becoming. There is a moment at which God will say, how'd you do with what I gave you in this life? And we're going to have to give an accounting of that. Have we chosen to serve money as our idol instead of seeking first the kingdom of God? there is a judgment on the choice that we ultimately make in that. And not only is there an ultimate kind of moment coming for us that's a bit, intimidating, but when we don't live faithfully with what God's given us, we also miss out on so many of the unbelievable blessings of seeing how He provides in miraculous ways for us. We totally get to miss out on a part of our life that will ultimately build a greater trust and love for God. And that is an incredible loss. But there's also a detrimental loss to our community if we choose to not be faithful in how God's called us to use our finances. Because we ultimately limit our ability as a whole, as God's church in the world, to care for the needs of our community, and also we limit our ability to fully engage in God's mission that He's called us to in the world. The reality is, God's mission still runs on money here in the world. To be able to go do things, to be able to go places, send missionaries places, to be able to open the doors and, have lighting. This all costs money, right? And so when we collectively don't be faithful with what God's given us, we limit what He can do through us in our community. And again, we miss out on seeing some of the incredible things God can do. And we might even miss out on the opportunities some people have to encounter Jesus. And that is an incredible loss. That's the danger. The confession I want to share with you is this. I want to confess to you that I have not been faithful as your pastor in talking about this as often as I should. I'm a chicken. Just going to be honest. This is a really hard conversation to stand up here and say, by the way, you guys all should be giving more to the kingdom of God when I know full well I get paid from what you give here at Lakewood. So because it feels like a conflict of interest in my own life, it makes it hard to stand up here and say, hey, we all should be doing this and stepping in this together, because it feels like I'm trying to ask you for money for me, and I'm not. So for my part, in not speaking about this faithfully, and as a result, limiting your discipleship and opportunity to experience the goodness of God in your life, I am truly sorry. That should not be. I shouldn't back down from things because they're hard for me to talk about when it's good for you. Please know, too, Tara and I still have a long way to grow in this area. Even as I was going through it this week, I'm like, wow, we could do better in that, right? We are still learning to grow in how we give and trust God. But I want you to know I'm going to work to correct this omission in what we do for teaching here at the church. Because I want you guys to be able to practice all the ways Jesus invites us to be able to grow and flourish in all of life, not just part of life. I don't want you to miss a part of what He's invited you into by not talking about it. So we'll keep talking about it. So please accept my apology. I truly am sorry. So as we wrap this up today, I just want to say, as we think about how to apply what we've heard, let's get going. Let's get training in generosity. 3 suggestions for you this morning. Number 1, limit your exposure to things that actually promote the story of greed in your life. Limit your exposure to advertising. Limit your exposure to online activities that feel like you don't have enough or that you are not enough. Stop listening to all those messages that say, if only you had this, you would be truly happy. They're just lying to you to get your money. Like, honestly. Give less of your attention. Incidentally, that's the most valuable thing we have these days, is our attention. Give less of your attention to the things that draw you away from the ways of Jesus into this other narrative about money. Let's limit our attention that we entrust to those who would want us to be enslaved by greed. So that's the first thing. Let's get away from some of that story. Second thing is, let's actually test God in tithing. Test God in the giving that you do to Him. Make your giving regular, joyful, sacrificial. Make it regular with intention. Because when we actually do things regularly with intention, it helps us build muscle and habits in things. It's actually what makes it easier to do over time. Incidentally, I started going to the gym in November. I know you can all tell, right? Don't have to say it. It's all right. But I can tell you it's a whole lot easier to get up at 5:10 every morning now than it was when I first started. When I first started, I want to throw my alarm clock out the window. Now, I usually wake up before my alarm because it has become habit, because it's regular. When we do things regularly, it actually builds muscle and makes it easier to do. So make our giving a regular practice. Make it joyful, because honestly, we will never outgive God, and God gave us stuff first. He's given us so much more than we could ever ask or imagine. So let's just give it back joyfully to Him, because we've received so much from Him. And finally, make it sacrificial. Giving generously will hurt a bit. King David once said, "I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord that costs me nothing." I won't do it. It should actually cost me something to give a gift to the King of Kings. Incidentally, when I go to the gym, if I choose to only work out with really, really light weights and do a few reps, how much progress do you think I'm going to feel? Not much. You need to actually feel it and have a little bit of pain for it to actually start to make a difference. So let's test God in tithing. And maybe think about those categories of tithing, all like to community worship, to your own personal investment in worship, as well as caring for the poor. How could we grow in these things and stretch ourselves into generosity? And finally, last thing, I had it there already. Dig deeper into the practice of generosity. Learn more about it. Grow in ways that you can try it out. And just real brief, I just want to say on Right Now Media, which is a video thing that we have through the church. You can access it on our website. I'll just put up the little picture here. Real quick, if you go to ministries on our website, and you click on Right Now Media. If you're not subscribed, you go through on this page, click on the link at the bottom. You can set up a profile, follow the prompts. Then you get to Right Now Media. You can click on Lakewood Alliance Church. And what you find is this, a page that only has one thing on it. Because I just started this week, about how to dig deeper from Sunday. It's the generosity practice. It's a five video session by John Mark Comer, who does Practicing the Way, and he has some really, really practical ways to start practicing generosity. So anyways, have a look at that if you want to dig deeper into this idea and practice of living generously with your life. How are we doing, church? You guys doing okay? Good. Well, let's move into our time of response, because we always like to give space for you to process what you've heard from the Lord, not from me, but from Jesus, and work that out in your own heart and mind. And so during our time of response, we're going to have a few songs. The worship team will lead us, which is a great chance just to celebrate what God has already done for us, how rich He has been towards us in blessing. We have the table set up here for us at the front. The Lord's table that's set with the bread that represents Jesus' body that was nailed to the cross for us to take the debt of our sin and pay for it for us. And set with the cup that contains the juice that represents His blood that was poured out to make that new reconciled relationship between us and God. Church, we come to this table to remember and to be nourished by Jesus. To be nourished and filled in the places we need, to remember His radical, generous gift of grace for you and for me. So please feel free to come. And as you come to the table, just practical note, the gluten-free bread is in the little glass dish on the plate. So if you need that, please take that. And also, once you've taken the elements, just take them back to your seat. And when you're ready, you can eat and drink the bread and the juice. We also have the prayer room open again this morning, and Terry and John are going to be in the prayer room and would love to pray with you. Like we said, Luke 12 comes after Luke 11, where Jesus taught His disciples to pray, and to pray, give us today our daily bread. So if you have needs from the Lord this morning, go. Seek prayer. Ask someone to pray with you for the things that you need, that you're seeking God to provide for you. And finally, a little later on in our response time, members of our hospitality team will come to receive our morning offering. It's an opportunity to test God a little bit this morning. Some of you have given online, that's great, but if it's non-electronic and giving this way, that will be your opportunity to give this morning and see what God will do. So church, why don't you stand as we begin our time of response, and let's just see what the Lord would have for us in this time.